Hello and welcome to week 4. Wow, time's going fast. Well, for week 4, it's our midterm exam at the end of the week. We have to have that turned in. But for today, we're going to go over chapter 5, which is in your midterm exam. But it's going to be a great part of your midterm exam. So, here we go. Chapter 5 is on such an important topic, especially when it comes to business communication. It's nonverbal communication. And I won't say it's complicated, but it's something that's very important. And a lot of times, working in the business organization, we tend to forget about the importance of nonverbal communication. So, what is something that we should definitely take note about? Believe it or not, the success of communication in an organization depends on how well managers, employees, and teams read nonverbal messages from their customers. So it's very important, as you can see, is how well you can be able to read the nonverbal messages. Organizations in the global economy represent a variety of cultures with different views of individualism and context. So not only do you have the importance of being able to know how to read nonverbal messages, now you have incorporated in that the fact that organizations that are going global now have to be able to view perhaps a culture that's completely different than yours, that have different types of nonverbal messages, and be able to interpret them correctly. Nonverbal code accounts for more than half of message meaning, and if messages conflict, people tend to pay more attention to nonverbal code, which is so true. I can't hammer this home enough. It's a way of saying it's not what you say, but how you say it. So it's so important that we have real control of our nonverbals, because people will definitely tend to pay more attention to our nonverbals than the words that are coming out of our mouth. The impact of nonverbal communication on your success in business cannot be overemphasized. Like I said, this is such an important chapter, such an important thing that we have to be able to really grab control of and develop skills in. Improving the capability of effective understanding, detect, and send nonverbal messages is an important skill. So it's not just important enough to be able to have control over the nonverbals that you use, but it's also important for us to be able to have control over that skill so that we can effectively understand other people's nonverbals and to detect people's nonverbals. And even when we are sending nonverbals, it is such an important skill. So let's move along. How would we define nonverbals? According to our textbook, nonverbal is all intentional and unintentional messages that are not written, spoken, or sounded. Those are considered nonverbal communication, nonverbal messages, especially in the business force. So let's go over something that is very important, that is met with a lot of, not clarity in the business world, but it's so important. It's culture and nonverbal messages. It is so important because understanding a nonverbal message in a business setting requires knowledge of the sender's frame of reference. Remember, we talked about that earlier in other chapters. Their cultural background, and even the specific situation. So all these things play into it. It's not just one thing per se, it's all of them. Also, some nonverbal messages are universal, such as facial shows of happiness, surprise, sadness, disgust, anger, fear. Those are usually all the same within a culture. It's just other things that can go along with it that can confuse you or even confuse them. Most nonverbal messages depend on the culture in which they occur, which was what I was trying to explain earlier. But within the culture, you can have different nonverbal messages, and what you think they mean may not be at all what they're trying to say. So it's very important for you to have that type of understanding. And also understanding the relationship between culture and nonverbal messages is through the dimensions of culture with 3 levels. And we're going to go over all 3 of those levels. The first level is something called the technical level. And in the technical level, it is where the rules for cultural and nonverbal behaviors are openly known and easily stated by most citizens of a particular culture. So if it's on a technical level, that means that usually everybody knows the rules and everybody knows what's stated. So there should not be any types of violations on a technical level because everybody knows what everybody's trying to say. Then there's the formal level. And in the formal level, the rules are clearly stated and known, but the reasons for the rules are not. So something is starting to change here. Formal rules are extremely important, and people who question them are not viewed as team players. So, in other words, they have all the rules that you should know, all the formal level nonverbals that you should use. But a lot of times the reasons are not known as to why you should use them. You just use them. And if you don't use them, then you're not a team player. Okay. Then there's also the informal level. And in the informal level, neither rules nor the reasons are known. Behavior is something that's just unconsciously learned. Maybe through practice. But people are not always aware that these behaviors are distracted by rules. But violations can lead to discomfort and they can even kick you out. Like, you're not a part of the group anymore, so be gone. So, most of the time, the majority of business-related nonverbal behavior are at the informal level. So, now do you see how sometimes they can become very, very tricky because neither the rules nor the reasons are known. But if you don't use them, then you can be quickly kicked out of the group. Okay, let's go over the types of nonverbal communication. We're going to go over all of these types of nonverbal communication. Each one we're going to go over individually. And I'm going to tell you just maybe a few points that make them so important and what we can do to be more skillful in this particular type of nonverbal communication. The first one that we're going to discuss is the facial expressions and eye contact. So, in America, you know that eye contact shows an interest and attentiveness, and it signals a wish to participate, and sometimes it can control and persuade others. You know how they say the eyes are the window to heaven. So usually with your eyes, you can do a lot. But it's not so in all countries or cultures where the eye contact is so important. So sometimes eyes and facial expressions are difficult to interpret and vary across cultures. Facial expressions are fairly open in the United States, but in Asian countries are more likely to suppress facial expressions. They don't believe in that direct eye contact. So you can see how that could be a problem if you're doing business with an Asian country and none of them are wanting to do eye contact. In America, we think people that don't want to look at us in our face or in our eyes are showing distrust or disloyalty to you, but perhaps they're not showing that at all. The next form of nonverbal communication is in the form of movements and gestures. And gestures are more closely tied to culture than a lot of times face and the eyes, because gestures can be divided into 4 different categories. The first one is emblems. And emblems are intentional movements that carry an exact verbal meaning. So, it's an emblem for something, and you know that for sure it carries the exact verbal meaning across the board. And illustrators are intentional movements that add to or clarify your verbal meaning, such as the officer here. She's using an illustrator. She's not only blowing her whistle, but she put her hand up, which means what? Stop. So, that's the illustrator. Not only is she using a movement, but she's also adding so that she can clarify what she means. Then there's regulators, which can control the flow of a conversation. And then lastly, there's adapters, which are habitual movements and is used when there is discomfort. Alicia Dickinson. Sorry about that. But anyway, and those are the types of things where we have to be willing to adjust to, because there's all different types of movements and gestures that are tied to nonverbal communication. This is that type. The next one that we're going to talk about is touch. Touch is a nonverbal communication that is strongly influenced by culture. As a matter of fact, most greetings across cultures require some form of touching. And although the handshake is becoming the universal greeting in business, some cultures use another form, and some do not use touch at all in some cases. So those are other types of things that we have to be really aware of, and we have to fight to try to control it. Another type of nonverbal communication that we're going to discuss next is clothing and appearance. Clothing and appearance are nonverbal cues that are seen before the message is even heard. So basically, clothing and appearance offers a lot. They say a lot about the person. Nonverbal cues are seen before they are heard, and the public perception of organizations depend in part on the employee's appearance. So appearance is very important. Like if you're going on a job interview, check before you go, or check and make sure that your job interview doesn't have any specific type of dress code. If you are a physician or a nurse, they see that before they even hear it. So they know that you're a physician or a nurse or a lawyer or a judge, even wearing your judge robe. or definitely any type of sports player. Entertainers, definitely. And even in the military, you can definitely see through clothing and appearance exactly what types of work that person is doing. Another type of nonverbal cues that we have is through distance and personal space. And Hall came up with distant categories. He said that the categories depend on distances. So, the first instance that he took note on is the intimate distance, where there is a contact no greater than 18 inches. And this is usually reserved, especially by Americans, for private use. The next one that he mentioned was personal distance. And personal distance is anywhere from 18 inches to 4 feet. And that is definitely used by close friends or colleagues when they are conversing informally. They just have that personal distance. Then there's also social distance. And social distance happens usually anywhere from 4 to 12 feet. And it is mostly used for informal and formal business transactions, just something to that particular sense. And lastly, we have the public distance, which is 12 feet or more. And in public distance, it is maintained between maybe perhaps a speaker and a large audience, just something so that there's a public distance. So that's how nonverbals are attached to distance and personal space. Now we're going to go to the physical environment. This physical environment actually reveals characteristics of the owner and affect how people within that organization communicate. Just through the physical environment. Each person in the environment produces an emotional response to the environment. And it is either a very positive or else it's a very negative emotional response. So just through physical things that happen within your business, like you could have like an ugly room and everybody walks in and says, this room is extremely ugly. Or you can walk in and you can say, wow, this room is so beautiful. And everyone acts differently. Or even the colors and the lightings within the room can have a big and vast effect on the emotions of the people in the room. The room size and the way the seats are arranged, or if there's a strange odor in the room, it can have a vast effect. Or if there's a lot of noise level, say you're having a conference and there's a window that's open and there's street noise and all kinds of chatter going on and people are not able to listen to you because it's too much noise. And then also it's a way the room is designed. If it's designed to be a pleasant, close feeling, then it's designed that way. Or if it's designed so that people are further apart and not touching, and then there might be another reaction to that. So that's part of the physical environment. Lastly, we're going to talk about time. Because time is a reaction that occurs at all three cultural levels that we talked about earlier. The consequences of arriving late depend on the relative rank of the people waiting and the people running late. So in other words, time can be controlled differently from people that are in higher ranks, more so than people that are in lower ranks. is less tolerant of them. People in higher ranks, oh well, he could have gotten in a car accident, he could have had an emergency meeting, whatever. But if it's you running late, it's a completely different story. Also, the amount of time people spend with each other often has informal significance. So, if your boss spends a whole lot of time, if you're trying to explain something, it has a lot of significance. And then the reaction to time behavior vary depending on where people were raised and their cultural backgrounds. So in other words, some people are just naturally going to be late people. They don't rush for anyone. They just take their time and they are just joyous and happy, just being there. They don't try to rush or hurry about anything. So see, now you see how all these different things play into it. There's just so many things. We're going to talk about nonverbal status symbols. Wow, those are deep. Remember we talked about all the different nonverbal cues? Well, now we're going to talk about how these things relate into being a status symbol within an organization. Clothing is definitely a status symbol. And it depends on the color of the clothes, and it depends on how they're dressed, and or if they're overdressed or anything, whether they're wearing a tie or a jacket, or say like they're not wearing a tie and everyone else in the organization is wearing a tie and they're not, then they're not going to be considered very high in the status symbol. Also, the location and size of the person's office are strong status symbols. Like, for instance, if you have a corner office, wow, and you have distance from the mainstream traffic in the office, you know, you're really heading on up there. So those are some of the things. And also the handling of time once again comes into it. The bosses can be late, or even they can be late, or they can even drop a meeting if they want to. You know, because of his status symbol, he doesn't necessarily have to stay on your time scheme. You have to be able to be abidant by his time scheme or her time scheme. And lastly, gestures play a lot into status symbols, in that the gestures that we use demonstrate, you know, like we have the right to have power status. Like if someone was over you, they could walk up to you and put their arm around you and say, good job, you know, and they would be accepted. Whereas if you would walk up to a boss and put your arms around them and go, good job, you might be looked at quite differently. So anyway, when you have higher status, you can get away with supposedly more things. So here are some more signs of power. You have an expansive, confident movement. The way you move through the office, you feel like you're tall and upright standing, and you feel like you are relaxed and familiar. You have the ability to turn one back on another. And you also sometimes have just a relaxed seated position as your body moves slightly forward. So those are things that show that you have power. Then there are also some nonverbal signs that show that you may perhaps be a weak boss. You have small, uncontrolled movements, you know, like twiddling your thumbs or popping your knuckles. Any form of bowing or bowed position shows that you love being a subordinate, supposedly. But then again, in Asian cultures, they do that as a sign of respect. So that's why I said a lot of these nonverbal meanings are for an American culture, but then when we go to other cultures, we have to be aware of theirs also. And you also are considered a weak boss when you have a nervous handshake and you hesitantly are standing or sitting forward all the time, and you have tenseness in your body, and you are very rigid. So those are signs that you are a weak boss. And then there's something that we have to definitely try to prevent, and it's something called culture shock. In international cultures often use unexpected nonverbal symbols and meanings. And when I say unexpected nonverbal symbols and meanings, I'm not necessarily saying unexpected nonverbal symbols and meanings towards themselves, but when you come into that culture, they are definitely unexpected nonverbal symbols and meanings that you perhaps may not understand. So inadequate training is a lot of the reason why culture shock happens so frequently in the workforce. As a matter of fact, 65% of companies did not provide any nonverbal cultural training. 40% returned home too soon because they were just so frustrated because they just did not understand the culture that they were going into. As a result, they became very culture shocked. They were not aware, they did not understand, they didn't have any preparation whatsoever. So it is so important that in your organization that you make sure that you fight for the right to make sure that everyone before they leave or have any type of intercultural connections with any type of other culture, that they should be well versed in what to expect. So therefore they don't have culture shock. So what are ways that we can improve our nonverbal skills? Well, one of the ways is, according to Bergen's theory, is that there is always going to be an expectancy violation. And with that, it means that basically we have to deal with how people respond when their nonverbal expectations are not met. So if the expectations are met, we judge others favorably. If the expectations are not met, we judge them unfavorably. So if this expectancy violation happens according as it is connected to nonverbal communication, and you are not culturally aware of how someone else is doing something differently and not doing it per se as an American would do it, then you are already not having your expectation violation satisfied. So you will react to that person unfavorably, according to Bergen's theory. The next theory that was raised is the immediacy behaviors. And with this one, they promote a feeling of closeness because the immediacy behaviors promote a sense of closeness and interactions with colleagues and customers through specific verbal, social, and visual behaviors. So that is why they become a sense of closeness by verbal behaviors, because you do something like you want to be very close to that person, so you use verbal behaviors like humor and personal examples and using things like, yes, we did this together and our team is the best team ever. So those are verbal ways that we can try to build some type of immediacy. And also there are vocal behaviors. when you talk to the person and you have good volume, you have good pitch, you have great vocal expressions while you're speaking what it is that you're speaking. They're more toned and ready to accept what it is that you're saying because they can hear you clearly and they can see within you that you really know what you're talking about, and you can definitely see through the vocal nonverbal cues that you are a great person to be bringing this type of message. Then there's also the visual behavior, and that is where you do things like smile, you have eye contact, you have a relaxed posture, you're moving around freely, and you know where you're doing, and you have a sense of just accomplishment in everything that you do. Well, that's all I have for today. So let's just summarize some of the things that we talked about. We definitely talked about the relationship between culture and nonverbal communication, and that it could be understood in terms of being technical, formal, and informal. We also talked about the nonverbal communication that is most relevant in business, which includes like the facial expressions, the eye contact, the postures and gestures, the touch, clothing, appearance, the distance in personal spaces, the physical environments, and even time. We talked about the nonverbal status symbols, like the clothing that we wear, the office size, the manipulation of time, the influence of how people perceive us, and our key factors in professional advancement. We also talked about the differences between the U.S. nonverbal messages and those of other countries, how it affects our international business dealings, and how it is so important that we try to work with companies so that they can have more international conferences so that you can definitely be well versed on that culture before you go into it. Make sure that you use caution when interpreting others' nonverbal behaviors, because overacting to nonverbal messages will cause just as many misunderstandings as just ignoring them. So make sure that we are very, very up to date and very skillful when it comes to interpreting nonverbal messages. Well, that's all we have for today. And as usual, if you have any questions or need anything answered, make sure you contact me. I will see you on Thursday, back with our next video recording for the week. And after you finish watching this video, make sure that you take the answer the discussion question, and get your attendance and extra credit point. Well, I hope that you are willing and ready and engaged enough that you will now want to become a great nonverbal communicator in your business affairs. All right. Have a great day.